Welcome to this flight in my Savannah MXP 740 aircraft in southwest France. It was on a dull day in August with broken cloud, but there was still plenty of rising air around to make for a very bumpy ride. It was from Sainte-Foy-la-Grande in the Gironde, just skimmed Bergerac-controlled airspace and ended at Chateau Malbec in the Dordogne. The Savannah is a two-seat high-wing, all-aluminium STOL or short takeoff and landing aircraft. Mine has leading-edge wing slats and is powered by a 100 horsepower Rotax engine, giving it a high rate of climb and a cruise speed of about 150 kilometers an hour. The flight was the final leg of a complete circumnavigation of the Bergerac control area. The first leg was from Chateau Malbec to Sainte-Foy-la-Grande. The second from Sainte-Foy-la-Grande to Saint-Julien-des-Mets, and the third from Saint-Julien to Sainte-Foy-la-Grande. Most of the flight, except for the first part and the very end, had to be at under 2,000 feet due to controlled airspace restrictions. After checking the flaps were retracted and all switches were off, the mags could be switched on and the engine started. Then, as always, it was essential to check that oil and fuel pressures were present and that the engine temperatures were correct and in range. The radio master could now be switched on to turn on the radio and transponder, followed by the strobes and landing light. After a short delay for the radio and transponder to come up, the Savannah was ready to taxi. No radio call was necessary on this occasion, as there was no other local traffic either on the ground or in the air. The Airfield plate for Sainte-Foy-la-Grande shows that it has a 1200 metre grass runway on 1028, with circuits for ultralights to the north at 600 feet and other aircraft to the south at 1000. FF Plums, the French Ultralight Association's version, shows that 28 that's being used today is the preferred runway. Today the Savannah will be turning right on climb out. There isn't an official plate for Chateau Malbec, but FF Plums shows a very short 160 metre grass runway on 0220 with a 7% upslope on 02 and landings on 02 and takeoffs on 20 only. A Chateau Malbec airfield plate might look something like this. Actual usable runway length 180 metres, but still short. Trees on all sides could affect landing, and obstructions at the runway end will influence go-around decision height. The landing threshold is above 2 white arrows on the runway surface. Reaching the end of the taxiway, it's essential to check the approach for any other aircraft before lining up for takeoff. After lining up, the fuel and engine pressures and engine temperatures are checked one last time before steadily opening the throttle up to full engine revs. The Savannah is quickly airborne in only 30 or 40 metres. Once airborne, the aircraft's nose must be held down until a safe climb speed has been attained. This is necessary to prevent the aircraft stalling, and failure to do so is probably the most common cause of takeoff accidents that are frequently fatal. As there was no conflicting traffic, a higher rate of climb than usual was possible, together with an early turnout. As mentioned earlier, my Savannah is capable of a very good rate of climb. Today, with just over half tanks and only one on board, it was climbing at nearly 1,000 feet a minute with an airspeed of about 130 to 140 kilometers an hour, which is excellent for an aircraft of its class. Because the direction of takeoff took the aircraft to the west and north of the desired route heading, it was necessary to continue the right-hand turn beyond the route heading until the desired track was reached. Then the aircraft could be turned left onto track towards the next en route waypoint. It wasn't worth including a recording of the flight from this point on, because firstly the visibility was not that good, and secondly the terrain being overflown was repetitive and not that interesting. Instead, we now jump directly to the approach phase for Chateau Malbec, which is much more interesting. With the Savannah in now what is really just a very long final, the first task is to reduce the engine revs to bleed off airspeed to under the flap limiting speed of 100 km an hour. With the airspeed low enough, one notch of flap can be added, which is all that will be necessary to land on Chateau Malbec's short, upward sloping runway. For the next few minutes, the challenge will be to remain on glide path for a landing at or at most just beyond the runway threshold, at or below a maximum airspeed of 100 km an hour. This is much more tricky than it sounds in today's rather turbulent conditions, and although the Savannah can safely fly at under 80 km an hour with one notch of flaps, today's conditions are quite challenging and a slightly higher approach speed will be desirable. The convention for any aircraft during the approach is that aircraft height is controlled by the throttle and glide angle and airspeed by the elevator. So at the chosen airspeed, if the aircraft becomes too high, the throttle is eased back, while at the same time, if necessary, pitching the nose down slightly until it is back on the glide path, and conversely if it becomes too low. A stabilised approach is essential for a safe controlled landing, especially at Chateau Malbec, where the landing must be nailed every time. Come in too fast or land too long, and the danger is that the aircraft will overrun the runway. Conversely, come in too short and land in the area with the arrows, and the aircraft will bounce at the very least, and if too slow, a broken undercarriage or even worse may well result. In case of even the slightest doubt, a decision to go around must be made early, as otherwise it is unlikely that the aircraft will clear the barns and trees at the top end of the runway on climb out due to the runway's upward slope. Pilots without current short field and altipore sloping runway experience are discouraged from visiting, and new visitors are required to sign and submit a landing request form for prior permission that also absolves the operator of any responsibility in the event that some mishap occurs. And the problems multiply in hot or turbulent conditions the closer that the aircraft gets to the ground. It also helps to have local knowledge, as on short final there's lift from the last large area of trees, followed by sink over the next patch of open ground, followed by lift again from the band of trees just in front of the runway. But it's essential to stay on the glide path though, to avoid a go-around, even if, like today, it means just exceeding the flap limiting speed. So with just a brief flare safely down again. All that was then left was to add a bit of power to taxi up to the top parking area, close the flaps, turn off all the switches and shut down the engine. Thanks for joining me on this flight, and see you again in the next one.